Jack Stevens was not the type of man to question his decisions. As a police officer, he firmly believed in the need to act quickly and with authority. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The uniform he wore every day was more than just a garment. It was an armor that separated him from the chaos and disorder he saw in the streets. For Jack, each day started the same way. He woke up before dawn, drank a cup of strong black coffee, and donned his uniform with ritual precision. He liked to see the badge shine in the morning light, a symbol of everything he stood for: order, control, and justice. Marcy, his wife, observed this ritual silently. She knew the man Jack became when he wore that uniform: distant, focused, and unwavering. But she also knew the Jack beneath that armor, a man who, over the years, seemed increasingly absent, even when he was physically present. That morning, like so many others, she tried to start a conversation, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she offered a shy smile and said, "Have a good day, Jack." He responded with a nod, his eyes fixed on the mirror as he adjusted his belt and made sure his gun was securely fastened. As he left the house, Jack felt the cool morning air hit his face, but the impact was minimal. Your mind was already occupied with what the day would bring. He got into his patrol car, started the engine, and drove through the city streets with the familiarity of someone who has been traveling the same route for years. The streets were still deserted, the early morning silence only broken by the sound of his car engine. For many, dawn was a symbol of new beginnings. But for Jack, it was just the prelude to another day of work. He liked this silence, the feeling of control it gave him. Arriving at the police station, Jack parked his car and walked to the entrance, greeting his colleagues with a brief wave. There was no need for words between them. Years of working together had created a tacit understanding. Sergeant O'Brien, a burly man with graying hair, waved to Jack from his desk, and Jack returned the gesture with equal brevity. He headed straight to his office, where a stack of reports awaited him. Jack always liked routine. It kept him focused, kept his mind from wandering to places he'd rather not go. But that morning, something was different. There was an uneasiness growing inside Jack, a feeling he couldn't quite identify. He tried to focus on the reports, but his mind kept returning to an image he couldn't shake. The face of a young man he had seen on the street last week, eyes filled with fear and distrust. Jack couldn't understand why that image disturbed him so much. He had dealt with thousands of people during his career, many of them with similar expressions, but something about this young man continued to haunt him. He left his office to get some coffee, hoping the walk to the diner across the street would help clear his mind. As he crossed the street, he noticed the streets starting to fill with life, people coming and going, but to Jack, they were just part of the scenery, except when they became a problem he needed to solve. Upon arriving at the diner, Jack ordered his usual coffee, but as he waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It was as if he was on the verge of a revelation, something he wasn't ready to face. He paid for his coffee and left, trying to shake off this uncomfortable feeling, but it followed him like a shadow. As he walked back to his office, he saw a young black man standing in the doorway of his building, looking around with an expression of uncertainty. Jack frowned. In his experience, young people like that often spelled trouble. He wasn't a prejudiced man, at least that's what he told himself. But he also knew that the world was full of dangers, and it was his job to identify and neutralize those dangers before they caused harm. He quickened his pace, his heart beating a little faster than normal. "What are you doing here?" Jack asked, his voice firm and emotionless. The young man looked up in surprise, but before he could respond, Jack continued, "This is no place for you. Go away." He expected the young man to obey without question, as so many others did. But the boy hesitated, his eyes filled with something Jack couldn't define. Maybe fear, maybe challenge. Jack stepped forward, his body blocking the young man's path. "You heard what I said. Get out of here before I have to make you leave." There was an implicit threat in his words, a promise of action he didn't want to fulfill, but was prepared to take if necessary. The young man looked at him for a moment longer, then lowered his head and walked away, moving slowly as if each step was a struggle. Jack watched him until he disappeared around the corner, then turned and walked into the building, his coffee still in hand. He had hoped that the uncomfortable feeling would disappear now that the young man was gone. But instead, he felt a weight in his stomach, a feeling he couldn't explain. Something about that encounter disturbed him, something he didn't want to admit, but knew he would need to face eventually. The day had started like any other, but now Jack found himself standing in front of a young black man, his hands clenched into fists, his body tense in a way he didn't immediately recognize. He was used to situations that required a strong presence, a steady hand. Years of patrolling the city's streets had taught him to be quick in his assessments, to react before the situation got out of control. But at that moment, something was different. The young man, who looked no older than 20, was standing in the doorway of Jack's building, his eyes shifting restlessly from side to side. He looked nervous, maybe scared. But Jack wasn't interested in the boy's feelings at that moment. All he saw was a possible problem that needed to be solved. "What are you doing here?" he repeated, his voice thick with authority. The young man lifted his head, his eyes meeting Jack's. There was something in his eyes that made Jack hesitate for a brief second. A mixture of fear and resignation, as if he was used to being treated this way. "I'm waiting for a friend," he replied, his voice low, barely audible. Jack frowned. "This is no place for you to wait for anyone," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "You should get out of here before someone calls the police." The words came out before Jack could stop them. He saw the young man's expression change, the fear in his eyes turning into something more, perhaps hurt, perhaps frustration. But Jack wasn't interested in interpretation at that point. To him, the young man was a liability, someone he needed to get out of the way to maintain order. "I don't want trouble," the young man said, taking a step back. "I'm just waiting for someone." But Jack had already made his decision. He advanced, his body blocking the young man's path. "Then go wait somewhere else," he said, his voice now carrying an unyielding authority. "This is a private building, and you have nothing to do here." The young man looked at him for a moment, then lowered his head, accepting his defeat. He turned on his heel and started to walk away, his hands shaking slightly. Jack watched him for a moment, his mind torn between the certainty that he had done the right thing and a nagging doubt that he couldn't shake. As the young man walked away, Jack felt a strange feeling of emptiness form within him. He had acted as he always did, quick, decisive, with no room for questioning. But something about that interaction made him uncomfortable. Maybe it was the look in the young man's eyes, or the way he accepted his situation without a fight. Or maybe it was the way Jack's words had come out of his mouth, filled with a harshness he didn't recognize in himself. Back in his office, Jack tried to focus on the reports he had to review, but his mind kept going back to the young man. He knew there was something wrong with the way he had handled the situation, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He was just doing his job, keeping order, like he always did. But the image of the young man, with his eyes full of fear and resignation, continued to haunt him. Jack tried to shake the feeling away, telling himself that he had done what was necessary. He couldn't allow someone, especially someone who looked out of place, to stand in the doorway of his office for no apparent reason. It was his duty to make sure the building was safe, that no one posed a threat. But as he sat at his desk, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake. He tried to justify his actions. The young man was in a place he shouldn't be. He had no right to be there. But the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if he was truly acting justly, or if he was simply reacting on instinct, an instinct shaped by years of patrolling a city where danger seemed to be everywhere. He remembered his training at the police academy, how they were taught to identify threats, to act quickly and without hesitation. But he also remembered something one of his instructors had said, something he hadn't thought about in a long time. Sometimes the threat you see is the one you project. At the time, Jack hadn't given this lesson much thought, but now, sitting in his office, he couldn't stop thinking about it. As the day passed, the image of the young man continued to haunt him. He tried to shake off the feeling of guilt, telling himself that he had done what needed to be done. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. He knew he needed to deal with this, but he didn't know how. And so, he did what he always did when faced with something he couldn't resolve. He pushed the feeling to the back of his mind and focused on the work in front of him. But the mind has a way of bringing to the surface what we try to ignore. And the more Jack tried to concentrate, the more the young man's image returned to his mind, like a shadow he couldn't escape. He knew there was something that needed to be faced, something inside him that he was avoiding. But he also knew it would require an honesty he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The day continued, and Jack continued to fight the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He knew that whatever it was just beginning, and he knew he would eventually have to deal with it. At the end of the day, Jack was about to leave when his office phone rang. He looked at his watch and hesitated for a moment before answering. "Stevens," he said, his tired voice reflecting the weight of the day that had passed. "Jack, it's Harrison," said the voice on the other end. Jack immediately recognized the serious tone of Harrison, a renowned lawyer in the city. They had crossed paths on several occasions over the years, and Jack had a grudging respect for him. Harrison was known for his direct approach and the way he dealt with injustices. If he was calling at this time, it was probably something important. "What can I do for you, Harrison?" Jack asked, straightening up in his chair. "I need a favor, Jack," Harrison replied, his tone softer than usual. "It's not a legal case, it's personal. A friend of mine, he's desperate. His son disappeared a few days ago." Jack felt his stomach turn. Disappearances were always complicated, especially when they involved young people. "Does he have any clues as to where the boy might be?" Jack asked, trying to keep the conversation on a professional tone. Harrison paused before responding, and when he did, his voice was thick with concern. "He thinks the kid might be on the street, trying to fend for himself. He's been getting into trouble lately. Nothing serious, but you know how these things can escalate." Jack nodded, even though Harrison couldn't see him. He knew exactly how quickly these situations could get out of control. "Do you have a description of the boy?" he asked, already taking a pen to write down the information. "Yes, he's in his early 20s, dark skin, short hair," Harrison began, but then stopped, as if trying to find the right words. He was last seen in a neighborhood near your office, Jack. I don't know if this helps, but I thought you could take a look, see if you find anything." Jack felt the weight of Harrison's words. He knew there was something more behind that description, something Harrison wasn't saying directly. "Do you think he's in danger?" Jack asked, his voice getting deeper. "I don't know, Jack," Harrison replied honestly. "But his father is very worried, and I promised I would do what I could to help." Jack wrote down the information Harrison gave, but as he did so, an uneasy feeling began to grow inside him. He remembered the young man he had encountered earlier that day, the frightened look in his eyes, the way he had hesitated before turning away. He tried to brush off this connection, telling himself it was unlikely it was the same person, but the feeling that something was wrong continued to persist. "I'll see what I can do, Harrison," Jack said finally. "If I find anything, I'll call you." "Thanks, Jack," Harrison replied, gratitude evident in his voice. I know this is a little out of the ordinary, but I really appreciate your help." When the call ended, Jack sat for a moment, looking at the notes he had made. The young man described by Harrison corresponded in many respects to what he had seen earlier that day. But would it be possible? Jack didn't want to believe that the young man he had pushed away could be the same one who was now missing. The idea that he could have made such a serious mistake began to grow inside him, but he tried to push it away. He was just doing his job, keeping order. However, the more he thought about it, the more the doubt grew. He got up from his chair and started pacing around the office, trying to clear his mind. He knew he needed to do something, that he needed to resolve this situation before it was too late. But where would he start? It had no more than a vague description and an uncertain location. Finally, he decided to go out and take a look at the neighborhood where he had found the young man. Maybe he was nearby. Maybe he was back. Jack felt his heart race as he walked out of the office and down the stairs. He knew he was about to embark on something that could change everything, but he also knew he had no choice. He drove through the now familiar streets, but this time with a new intensity, his eyes searching for any sign of the young man. He stopped at every corner, looked down every alley, but found nothing. The sense of urgency began to turn into desperation. What if he had let something happen to that boy? What if he had made a mistake that now couldn't be fixed? Jack finally stopped the car on a deserted street and turned off the engine. He felt the weight of his actions come down on him like a sledgehammer. He had to find that young man. He had to make sure he was safe. But more than that, he had to confront what was growing inside him, the certainty that he had misjudged, that he had let his prejudice dictate his actions. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but Jack also knew he couldn't help it anymore. He needed to face the truth, not just about the young man, but about himself. And that, he realized, was what terrified him most. As Jack continued his search through the city streets, the weight of his guilt only increased. With each empty alley, each deserted corner, he felt despair growing within him. He had always prided himself on being a fair cop, someone who did what was right, but now he was starting to question everything he thought about himself. Had he really acted justly that day? Or had he allowed his prejudices to take over, leading him to judge and condemn an innocent young man? These questions continued to swirl in his mind as he drove, the city lights passing him by in a blur. He tried to focus on the task at hand, finding the young man, but his mind kept going back to that moment when he had confronted him. He remembered the look in the boy's eyes, fear mixed with a kind of resignation. It was as if the young man was used to being treated this way, as if he already expected to be judged and rejected. Jack stopped the car in a park, turning off the engine. He needed a moment to clear his mind, to try to understand what was happening inside him. He got out of the car and walked to a nearby bench, sitting down with a heavy sigh. The park was quiet, almost deserted at this time of night, and the silence around him only amplified the noise inside his head. As he sat there, Jack began to think about his own life, about how he had gotten to this point. He remembered his childhood, growing up in a poor neighborhood where the police were rarely seen as a force for good. He remembered how officers treated young people like him with suspicion and distrust, as if they were guilty of something simply by existing. He had promised himself that he would be different, that he would be a police officer that people would respect and trust. But now, he was starting to wonder if he had actually kept that promise. He thought about all the times he had judged someone quickly, without really stopping to understand the situation. He always told himself that he was just doing his job, that he needed to be quick and decisive to maintain order. But now, he was starting to see the flaws in his logic. Perhaps he had allowed his prejudices to creep into his decisions, influencing the way he viewed and treated certain people. And if that was the case, What did that say about him as a police officer? As a man? Jack ran his hands over his face, trying to push away these thoughts. But they kept coming back, stronger and stronger. He knew he couldn't ignore what he was feeling anymore, but at the same time, he didn't know how to deal with it. He was always the kind of man who dealt with problems in a practical way, solving things with action rather than introspection. But now, he was being forced to confront something within himself that he had avoided for so long. He remembered Harrison's words about the need to reevaluate his own attitudes and prejudices. At that moment, Jack had agreed on the surface, but now he was beginning to understand the depth of what Harrison was suggesting. He needed to look inside himself, at the prejudices he had ignored or denied. And this was a prospect that terrified him. He knew it would require brutal honesty, a willingness to confront parts of himself he preferred to keep hidden. As he sat there, Jack realized that his search for the young man was more than just an attempt to right a wrong. It was a search for redemption, not just in the young man's eyes, but in his own. He needed to find a way to make peace with what he had done, but also with who he had become. And that was something he knew wouldn't be easy. Finally, he stood up from the bench, feeling a new determination rise within him. He knew he needed to keep looking for the young man, that he needed to make sure he was safe. But he also knew that the real battle was just beginning. The battle within himself to confront and overcome the prejudices he had allowed to shape his actions. Jack walked back to the car, feeling the weight of his decisions on his shoulders. He knew he was on a journey, not just to find the young man, but to find himself. And as he drove through the dark streets, he prepared himself for what was to come, knowing that real change would have to start within himself. The city lights flickered around him as he drove, each street seeming like a new opportunity to find the young man, and at the same time, a new chance to face the demons that haunted him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't help it anymore. He needed to face the truth, not just about the young man, but about himself. And he was determined to do it, no matter how difficult it was. As he continued his search, Jack began to realize that this journey was not just about finding a lost young man, but about finding a way back to himself, to the man he always wanted to be, but who had perhaps lost his way along the way. Of the path. Jack knew that finding the young man was just the first step. He was aware that true redemption would not only come from locating the boy, but from deeply understanding the mistake he had made and facing the prejudices that had influenced his actions. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but he was determined to do whatever was necessary to correct the course of his actions. He had to prove to himself and to the young man that there was still something good inside him, something trustworthy. Jack began his search with renewed intensity. He returned to the neighborhood where he had first encountered the young man, walking the streets and asking people who might have seen him. He described the young man to everyone he met, store owners, restaurant workers, passers-by, but no one seemed to have any useful information. The city, with all its immensity, seemed increasingly oppressive, and the task of finding a single person among so many people was daunting. Time seemed to pass too quickly, and Jack felt every second like an increasing loss of opportunity. He visited shelters and community centers, hoping that the young man had sought some kind of refuge. Every time he asked his questions, he felt a pang of guilt in his chest, an ache that seemed to grow as he repeated the same words to strangers. The responses he received were always the same, expressions of indifference or suspicious looks that questioned what exactly a police officer was doing there. At one of the shelters, Jack met a social worker who seemed to have a vague idea of what was going on. She was a woman in her 50s with eyes that showed the experience of someone who had seen many young people in difficult situations. She looked at Jack with a mixture of understanding and skepticism, as if trying to decide if he was trustworthy. "Are you really trying to help?" she asked, her voice filled with a doubt that made Jack feel uncomfortable. "Yes, I am," he replied, his voice firm and sincere. "I made a mistake, and now I'm trying to fix it." The woman watched him for a moment before finally agreeing to help. "There's a group of young people who meet in an abandoned building downtown," she said. "It's not a safe place, but it's where a lot of people go when they have nowhere to go. Maybe he's there." Jack thanked the social worker and headed to the location she mentioned, his heart beating faster as he got closer. The building was exactly as she had described it, abandoned, with broken windows and walls covered in graffiti. The sight of the place only increased the sense of urgency Jack felt. He knew that if the young man was there, he would need to act quickly to ensure his safety. Upon entering the building, Jack heard low voices, young people talking in whispers. He followed the sound until he found a group of teenagers gathered in a dark corner, their faces partially hidden by the darkness. When they noticed Jack's presence, the conversation stopped abruptly, and everyone turned to him with looks full of suspicion and fear. Jack knew that the presence of a police officer there would not be welcome. He also knew that he would need to approach the situation with caution. "I'm looking for a boy," Jack began, his voice low and unhurried, trying to sound as non-threatening as possible. He described the young man he had encountered earlier that day, but the teens stared at him silently, their expressions closed and defensive. He could feel the tension in the air, the distrust emanating from them. They didn't trust him, and Jack didn't blame them for that. He knew that in their eyes he was just another cop, someone who posed a threat, not help. Finally, one of the teenagers, apparently braver or more desperate than the others, stepped forward. "He was here," the boy said, his voice shaking. "But he left. He said he was scared, that someone was after him." Jack felt a stab of pain in his chest. The young man was running away, not just from the dangers of the streets, but from his own actions. He was afraid of Jack, afraid of what might happen if they met again, and that realization weighed on Jack more than anything else up to that point. He understood that the boy was not just running away from the streets. He was running from Jack, from the man who had treated him like a criminal, without even giving him a chance. Thanking the young people, Jack left the abandoned building, feeling more lost than ever. He had underestimated the impact of his actions, the damage a simple act of prejudice could cause. And now, he was racing against time, trying to correct his mistake before it was too late. As he walked through the dark streets, Jack felt a new determination rise within him. He had to find the young man. He had to make sure he was safe. And more than that, he had to prove to himself and the boy that he was a man of honor, someone who could be trusted, someone who really cared. Jack's search turned into something deeper than just finding the young man. It was a journey of self-discovery, a search for redemption, and the opportunity to regain his own humanity. And as he continued to search, he knew that no matter what happened, he needed to keep going, needed to find a way to right his mistakes, and, in the process, maybe find a way to forgive himself. Jack finally found the young man in a dimly lit alley, leaning against a brick wall, his eyes fixed on the ground. He looked exhausted, as if he had been running without stopping, both physically and emotionally. When Jack approached, the young man raised his head, and his eyes widened with fear as he recognized the police officer who had humiliated him hours before. Jack stopped a few feet away, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender, trying to convey that he posed no threat. "I just want to talk," Jack said, his voice soft, almost pleading. He knew he needed to be careful, that the slightest sign of aggression could make the young man run away again. The boy didn't respond, but he didn't move either, which Jack took as a sign that there was still hope of making things right. "I made a mistake," Jack continued, stepping forward carefully. "I was wrong to judge you without knowing what you were going through. I'm sorry for that." The young man continued to stare at Jack, his eyes still filled with distrust. He seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps for Jack to show his true intentions. Jack knew words wouldn't be enough. He needed to prove that he was there to help, that his intentions were genuine. "I spoke to someone who's worried about you," Jack said, trying to find a way to reach the boy. "Someone who cares. They want you to be safe, and so do I." The young man finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "You treated me like I was a criminal. You didn't even ask why I was there. You just decided I didn't belong." The young man's words hit Jack like a blow. He knew the boy was right, and that truth hurt more than anything he had ever faced in his career. He had judged the young man, not by what he had done, but by what he appeared to be. And now, he was faced with the consequences of that. "I know," Jack replied, his voice thick with guilt. "I was wrong, and I can't change what I did, but I want to do what's right now. Please give me a chance." The young man looked at him, his eyes still filled with a mixture of emotions that Jack couldn't completely decipher. Fear, distrust, maybe even a spark of hope. But whatever it was, Jack knew he had to grab this opportunity with both hands. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jack said, taking another step forward. "I just want to help you get out of here. Find somewhere safe." The young man hesitated, but finally, reluctantly, he took a step towards Jack. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but for Jack, it was enough. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but this was the first step. He extended his hand, hoping the young man would accept it. After what seemed like an eternity, the young man finally took Jack's hand, his fingers shaking slightly. "I don't know if I can trust you," he said, his voice thick with uncertainty. "I understand," Jack replied, gently squeezing the boy's hand. "But I'm here, and I'm going to prove that you can." Together they began to walk out of the alley, the darkness around them slowly giving way to the lights of the city. Jack knew what came next wouldn't be easy. He would have to earn the young man's trust, prove that he was committed to doing the right thing. And perhaps in the process, he would also find a way to forgive himself. As they walked, Jack began to realize the enormity of the journey ahead. He wasn't just trying to help a young man in need. He was trying to repair the damage he himself had caused, and that would take more than he was used to giving. It would take patience, empathy, and above all, humility, qualities he had neglected over the years but now knew were essential. When they reached a safer place, Jack suggested they stop to rest. He took the young man to a coffee shop that was still open, ordering 2 coffees. They sat at a table in the back, away from prying eyes. The young man still looked nervous, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if he expected something bad to happen at any moment. Jack knew this anxiety wouldn't go away easily, but he hoped that with time, the young man would be able to relax and start to trust him. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Jack asked, his voice calm and patient. The young man shook his head, looking at the coffee cup as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. "No, not really. I've been sleeping on the streets, in shelters when I can." Jack felt a tightness in his chest when he heard that. He knew life on the streets was brutal, especially for someone so young and vulnerable. He wanted to help. He wanted to make sure the boy was safe, but he knew he couldn't force anything. "I can help you find a safe place to stay," he suggested, choosing his words carefully. The young man finally raised his eyes to meet Jack's. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice filled with suspicion. Jack took a deep breath before responding. "Because I made a mistake, and I want to do what's right. I can't change what I did, but I can try to make things right now." The young man watched him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Okay," he said, his voice still hesitant, but with a little openness. "I'll let you help me, but I still don't trust you." "I understand," Jack replied, "and I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I do hope that in time, I can prove that you can." They finished their coffee in silence, but Jack felt something had changed. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. He knew the journey would be long, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. In the days that followed, Jack dedicated himself to gaining the young man's trust, but he knew it would be a difficult task. The barrier between them was still palpable, and Jack was aware that his words, however sincere they were, would not be enough to erase the memory of their first meeting. The young man, whose name was Marcus, still maintained a cautious distance, a protectiveness that Jack understood perfectly. Jack began helping Marcus find a safer shelter where he could stay without the constant fear of being kicked out or attacked. The shelter he placed him in was run by a community organization dedicated to helping vulnerable young people, offering not only a place to sleep, but also emotional support and resources so they could rebuild their lives. Jack accompanied Marcus to the shelter, making sure he got settled in comfortably. However, even with all the help, Jack could see that Marcus still wasn't at ease. He was polite, but distant, and Jack knew that every step he took towards the young man needed to be done carefully. There was a fragility in the relationship they were beginning to build, something that could fall apart at the slightest sign of distrust. One afternoon, as Jack visited the shelter to check on Marcus, he found him sitting alone in a community room, playing a guitar the shelter had provided. The music he played was soft, melancholic, and Jack felt a lump in his throat as he realized how much pain Marcus was probably carrying inside. He approached slowly, so as not to scare him, and sat in a nearby chair, listening in silence. "You play very well," Jack said softly when Marcus finished the song. "Where did you learn?" Marcus shrugged, still avoiding looking directly at Jack. "I learned it on my own, on the streets. It's a good way to forget things." Jack nodded, understanding exactly what Marcus meant. "I suppose it is. Music has a way of transporting us to another place, doesn't it?" Marcus didn't respond, but continued to play the guitar strings, playing a melody without compromise. Jack watched silently, respecting the space Marcus seemed to need. He knew he couldn't force anything, that the trust he hoped to gain had to be earned slowly. After a while, Jack decided to try a different approach. He remembered that when he was younger, before becoming a police officer, he had dreamed of being a musician. He hadn't played in years, but he still remembered some things. "Would you mind if I tried?" he asked, reaching for the guitar. Marcus hesitated, but after a moment, he handed the instrument to Jack. Jack picked up the guitar and adjusted the strings, playing a few notes before starting a melody he had known since he was a teenager. He wasn't as good as Marcus, but the music still had a calming effect on him. When he was done, he handed the guitar back to Marcus, who took it without saying a word. It was a small gesture, but Jack could tell something had changed. Marcus didn't seem so distant anymore, although there was still a reserve in his eyes. Jack knew that trust was something that needed to be cultivated, and that it would take time, but he was willing to wait. Over the next few days, Jack continued to visit Marcus regularly, bringing him small gifts, books about music, new guitar strings, even some sheet music he had found at a local store. He knew these gestures wouldn't erase what had happened, but he hoped they would show Marcus that he was committed to helping, that he truly cared. Marcus began to open up, little by little. He still didn't completely trust Jack, but he was beginning to see that the officer wasn't the man he had thought him to be. They talked about music, about life on the streets, about the future Marcus hoped to have. Jack listened more than he spoke, knowing that the young man needed someone to listen to him without judging him. There were times when Jack felt like he was making progress, but there were also times of setback, when Marcus retreated again, remembering why he had distrusted Jack in the first place. Jack accepted these setbacks with patience, knowing that trust was not something that could be forced. One afternoon, Jack decided to take Marcus for a walk outside the shelter, an effort to show the young man that he could trust him. They went to a nearby park, where Marcus played the guitar while Jack watched. It was a peaceful, almost normal scene, and Jack felt a twinge of hope that perhaps, in time, they could build something resembling a friendship. But he knew there was still a long way to go. Marcus still bore scars, both physical and emotional, that would not be easily healed. And Jack also knew that he himself had scars that he needed to face. He still blamed himself for what had happened, still wondered if he could have acted differently on that first date. But for now, he focused on being there for Marcus, on doing what he could to help him find a way back to normalcy. As the sun set over the horizon, bathing the park in golden light, Jack and Marcus sat in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Jack knew the road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and uncertainty, but he was determined to follow it. Not just for Marcus, but for himself. He needed to prove to both of them that there was still something good in him, something worth fighting for. After weeks of living together, Jack and Marcus began to build a relationship based on cautious trust. It wasn't complete trust, but an understanding that they were both trying to heal in their own ways. Jack knew there was a lot of work ahead, both in helping Marcus recover and in facing his own inner demons. He wasn't naive. He knew the damage caused by that first encounter wouldn't be easily forgotten, but he was also determined not to give up. One day, Marcus finally mustered up the courage to talk about the friend he had been waiting at the door of Jack's office the day it all started. The friend was one of the few people Marcus trusted completely, someone who had helped him through the most difficult times in his life. Marcus had felt lost since his friend didn't show up that day, as if he had lost the last anchor that kept him safe. Jack listened to the story in silence, feeling Marcus's pain as if it were his own. "I need to find him," Marcus said, his voice thick with urgency. "He's like a brother to me. I don't know what I'll do if something happens to him." Jack nodded, sensing the gravity of the situation. He knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for Marcus, but for both of their journeys toward healing. "We'll find him, Marcus," he said firmly. "I promise I will do everything I can to help you." After days of searching and asking, Jack finally got a lead on the whereabouts of Marcus's friend. He was in a hospital, the victim of an attack that left him seriously injured. The news shook Marcus to his core, but it also gave him clear direction. Jack knew they needed to go to the hospital, that Marcus needed to see his friend and understand what had happened. When they arrived at the hospital, Marcus was nervous, his hand shaking slightly as he held the guitar Jack had given him weeks before. They walked together through the cold, sterile hallways, the silence between them thick with tension and expectation. Marcus was visibly shaken, but there was a determination in his step that Jack deeply respected. As they entered the room, Marcus stopped at the door, his eyes fixed on his friend's fragile figure on the bed. The young man was pale, with tubes connected to him and the monotonous sound of monitors filling the room. Tears began to stream down Marcus's face, but he didn't move. Jack, realizing the difficulty of the moment, placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder, offering him silent support. "Go ahead," Jack whispered, his voice soft and comforting. "He needs you now." Marcus finally stepped forward, sitting next to his friend's bed. He placed the guitar on his lap and, with shaking hands, began to play a soft, sad melody. Music filled the room, creating a bridge between the two friends, a connection that transcended words. Jack watched from afar, respecting their space, but feeling a deep admiration for Marcus, for his strength and loyalty. Marcus's friend slowly opened his eyes to the music, a faint smile forming on his lips. He tried to speak, but he was too weak. Instead, he shook hands with Marcus, who continued to play, his tears falling silently onto the guitar. Jack felt a wave of emotion course through his body. He knew this moment was crucial to Marcus's healing, an opportunity for him to reconcile with his past and begin to build a safer future. After a while, Jack decided to leave the room, giving them the space they needed to reconnect. He walked through the hospital corridors, reflecting on everything that had happened in the last few weeks. He knew there was still a lot to be done, but at that moment, he felt he had taken an important step. He couldn't change the past, but he was determined to shape a better future for Marcus, and perhaps for himself as well. When Jack returned to the room, Marcus and his friend were silent, but there was a sense of peace in the air. Marcus looked at Jack, his eyes filled with something new, something Jack recognized as hope. "Thank you," Marcus said simply, his voice full of gratitude. Jack just nodded, feeling a rush of emotion. He knew that thank you meant more than anything he could express in words. He had given Marcus a chance at reconciliation, a chance at healing, and this was more than he had expected. As they walked out of the hospital together, Marcus clutching his guitar and a new spring in his step, Jack knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but he also knew they were ready to face these challenges together. Jack had found something he didn't even know he was looking for, a chance at redemption, a chance to make peace with himself. As they walked through the city streets, Jack felt that for the first time in a long time, he was on the right path. The future was still uncertain, but it was full of possibilities. And for Jack, that was more than enough. He had begun the journey to right his wrongs, and now he was determined to see this journey through to the end. The city around them continued to pulse with life, but for Jack and Marcus, it was as if time had slowed down, allowing them to enjoy this moment of peace and reconciliation. And as they walked toward an uncertain future, they both knew that together they could face whatever challenge lay ahead.